Okay, so here it comes, the first shir from the Gush Etzion. Gush Etzion, as you all know, is south of Yerushalayim, halfway, in fact, between Yerushalayim and Hebron. You know, when I spoke to a few of my non-Jewish friends in London, I told them I'm moving to this place. They say, where is it? I say, well, it's halfway between Bethlehem and Hebron. They think, oh my gosh, it's a war zone. There must be bullets flying overhead all the time. You know, how can you possibly live in this place? In actual fact, it's a very idyllic, beautiful countryside existence here. Lots of the Yeshuvim here are very beautifully developed. There's one place called Neve Daniel, and there's Elazar, and there's Efrat itself has got, Efrat is situated on a whole range of hilltops. And each one of these little hilltops is named in connection with one of the Shivat HaMimim. So you've got Dagan and Tamar and Dekel and Rimon and Te'ina and Geffen. These are the different areas of Efrat. We're living in Rimon. Actually, Rimon was the very first area that was built by Rabbi Riskin and his merry men about 40 years ago. And they came to a completely barren hillside in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by the Arabs of Beit Lechem and other villages. And they pitched their tent here. And today there are thousands of people living in this yeshuv, and it's a very beautiful place. Where's the lighting here on this? As I can see from my screen, it's a bit dark, isn't it?
Yeah.
A little bit dark. Maybe if I moved a bit back or a bit to the side. Okay, I have to play with that a little bit.
Yes, that's fine. Yeah.
That's a bit better, right?
I think it's maybe the sunshine coming from the window, possibly. Have you got a sun glaring in from one angle?
Yes. Is that a bit better?
Okay, we see you very well.
Much.
Might need a bit more illumination
exactly right.
from on top. You may need better lighting from the ceiling. That's fine. It's just radiating on one cheek, but otherwise it's fine.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so the theme of this series of shiurim is to learn the whole of the book of Bereshis a little bit in greater depth, and show how, in which way, in Sefer Bereshis really lies the roots of so much of Jewish life. So one of the things I wanted to maybe look at today, we are in the middle of looking at, if you remember last week, we learned a piece of the Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Kuzari about Avraham Avinu, and I plan to learn a piece of Rambam with you, which contrasts Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's ideas. But since we are Erev Chanukah, please God, we'll be lighting the first Chanukah light. We light the first Chanukah light on Sunday night. So I thought I'd show you, surprisingly, a link between the book of Bereshis and Chanukah. Just to give you maybe a little bit of an original idea connected to Chanukah, of the usual traditional story of Chanukah. As we all know, the word Chanukah and the idea of Chanukah connects with Chanukat Habayit. Chanukat Habayit, which was the Bayis Sheni. The book of Maccabees tells us that actually the Hashmonaim rededicated the Beis HaMikdash after it had been contaminated by the pagan Hellenists, had contaminated it. They rededicated it on the 25th of Kislev, right? And that was the date of the rededication of the Beis HaMikdash. And of course, it's also connected to the time when they rededicated it by relighting the menorah, and they finally got, as we all know, the oil, which lasted miraculously for 8 days. But it's not just the oil that lasted miraculously, it's the idea of the Chanukah Habayis. What's interesting is if you look in the Sefer, in the Tanakh, in Sefer Chagai, in chapter 2, so Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi were the last 3 Nevi'im in the whole prophetic era of the Tanakh, and Chagai was still there to see the inauguration of the Bayis Sheni. And it turns out that the Chanukah Habayis originally of the Bayis Sheni was the 25th of Kislev. So really what's happening here is that the Hashmonaim in the Hanukkah story are taking the date of the original, which of a couple of hundred years earlier, when the Bayis Sheni was originally dedicated, and they're rededicating it on that date. So that date has a significance in the Jewish calendar regarding the Second Temple period and the rededication of the Beis Hamikdash. And we all know the stories of Hanukkah, the battle against the Hellenists and Yehuda Maccabi. These are the stories we've all grown up with. What I'd like to try and show you is a piece of a Mishnah. I want to learn with you together a Mishnah and a Gemara this morning, which throws, I think, it doesn't actually mention Hanukkah at all. But the Maharal of Prague connects this Mishnah and Gemara to Hanukkah. But I'd like to first just give you a little bit of an introduction to the Mishnah that we're about to learn. One of the Masechtas of Mishnah and Gemara is the Masechta of Avodah Zarah. Now, that might sound a bit strange to people that we dedicate a whole volume of Mishnah and Gemara to Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah, you would have thought, is probably, undoubtedly, the most often repeated spiritual disaster for the Jewish people throughout the whole of the Chumash and the Tanakh, right? Hishamu lachem v'nifte levavachem v'sartem v'avaratem Elohim achirim v'shtachavisa lahem v'chora af Hashem bochem, right? Parsha Shema, we say every day that the greatest single danger in the ancient world was to be drawn to pagan practices and into the beliefs of Avodah Zarah. The truth is, for us today, with a modern mindset, it's hard to understand exactly what was so unbelievably attractive and was so irresistibly the irresistible pull of the pagan world. But I'm going to leave that aside for the moment. It's certainly the case. You can read the whole of Sefer Yeshua and Shoftim and Malachim Aleph and Malachim Beis, and the single greatest disaster throughout all the Tanakh narrative is large sections of Klal Yisrael being drawn into Avodah Zarah. But the Chazal gave us a tractate, a Masechta, Mishnayos and Gemara, dealing with Avodah Zarah, because it was very important for us to know what is and what isn't Avodah Zarah, which is very interesting, because you would have thought they would simply have banned all studies of Avodah Zarah and made it all forbidden. But on the contrary, that's not the derech of the Torah. The derech of the Torah is you've got to know the dangers. You've got to know what you're dealing with. And every member of the Sanhedrin and every rabbi who practiced in the ancient world needed to know in detail every single ritual of every single Avodah Zarah, for many reasons. First of all, they needed to know when people were committing the Aveira. In other words, if you didn't know what the rituals were, you didn't know what was forbidden and what was permitted. You also had to know what to keep away from. But there was also another very interesting aspect of Avodah Zarah, which went like this. There is in the Torah, one of the Taryag mitzvahs is Lifnei Iver Lo Sitein Michshal, which literally means, Pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim, not to put a stumbling block before the blind. But Chazal understood it to mean something else completely. They understood it to mean not to act in such a way that you are encouraging or facilitating somebody else to do an Aveira, right? If you gave non-kosher food to somebody and encouraged them to eat it, even though you weren't doing any issur of eating treifa, he was doing it. but by facilitating him or encouraging him to do it, you are violating the Issur of Lifnei Iver Lo Sitei Michal, putting a stumbling block before the blind. In this case, it wasn't somebody who was, if you like, physically blind. It was somebody who was spiritually blinded. In other words, this person was spiritually blinded to the effect that he wanted to eat treif, and you simply supplied him with a treifus. That is an Issur of Lifnei Iver Lo Sitei Michal. Similarly, in the ancient world, maybe even today, engaging in the arms trade, Chazal speak about, is a problem of Lifnei Iver Lo Sitei Michal, to give armaments to somebody who is choshud al haratzicha, who is known to have murderous intentions. You can't just say, well, I just sold him a gun. The fact that he went to shoot people with it is his problem. Lifnei Iver means facilitating other people to do averos. One of the surprising features of this halacha is that it not only applies when the transgressor is a member of the Jewish people, but it also applies when the transgressor is a non-Jew. In other words, the non-Jewish people in this world, from our point of view, are forbidden to engage in avodah zarah. Every non-Jew who engages in pagan worship is in violation of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. He's in violation of the 7 Noachide principles. And therefore, if we encourage a non-Jew in his pagan practices, the Jewish person who encourages him, transgresses one of the Tarek mitzvahs. It's very interesting, halachically, the lomdus of it is quite interesting, how it's possible for me, for a Jewish person to transgress Lifnei Iver when the transgressor is in fact a non-Jew. But you have to understand that the Chazal took very literally and seriously the idea that the entire non-Jewish world is technically committed to the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, and therefore we are not allowed to encourage them in their pagan practices. So this meant, for example, that if in their pagan practices they were, say, for example, offering up sacrifices of bulls, and you happened to be a cattle dealer and you were selling bulls, so as a Mishnah, you weren't allowed to sell them these animals at the period of time when they were having their pagan feasts. So suddenly it became important to know, when are the pagan feasts and how do the pagan feasts work and what is it exactly? And you should know it gave rise to all sorts of different halachic literature. There are lots of shilas and shuvas. I don't know whether are Jewish candle manufacturers allowed to sell candles to the church? Are we in fact facilitating their avodah zarah, right? Are we allowed to give and do commerce with the non-Jewish world? All these are very, very interesting questions. And it gave rise, of course, to an enormous literature on the subject, which is the subject for a whole different shir or a series of shirim, whether we consider Christianity to be avodah zarah or not. Is Christianity itself considered to be avodah zarah? And for those of you who are interested, right, the very, very first Mishnah, the first Amud on Daf Beis Amud Aleph of avodah zarah, there's a whole long Tosfos on that question, because of course the Baalei Tosfos lived in a Catholic Europe in the 12th, 13th century, and they were surrounded by Catholics, by Christians, by believing Christians. And of course, many of the Baalei Tosfos are also in the wine business and selling wine to the Catholics at a time when their ritual included the drinking of wine, would be a problem if and only if you considered Catholicism to be avodah zarah. If it was avodah zarah, then this became a problem. So this is a major halachic, mishnaic, and Talmudic issue, which I don't intend to pasken halachas on myself at this particular point, but it has a bearing on our life as well, because of course, if you do take the view that Christianity is real avodah zarah, then it's not permitted to go and visit any churches. You can't go to the Sistine Chapel. You can't go and visit any cathedrals because it's real Avodah Zarah. If it's real Avodah Zarah, you can't set foot in there, right? If it's not Avodah Zarah, if it's just something which we're not allowed to do, but they are allowed to do, then that's a different story. And this is something of a lively debate. And if you're planning to visit any cathedrals in the near future, you should consult your local Orthodox rabbi and see what he has to say on the subject. But you have to be aware that you might get a psak, that it's not such a good idea to go there, and that's a whole different story. Of course, the Muslims don't have a problem with Avodah Zarah. They are very monotheistic. They are, in fact, militantly monotheistic. To murder people, that's not a subject not something I tend to get into for the time being. But that's a different one of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. They're pretty good on the monotheism. They're not so good on the Lo Tirtzach part of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, and we'll do that some other time. I'll call upon him. What has all this got to do with? What has all this got to do with Hanukkah? And you'll be surprised to know that we're now going to learn a Mishnah together, and the Mishnah, having said that we need to be careful, we, the Jewish people, living among the pagan Romans of the Mishnaic era, we have to be careful that we are not facilitating and encouraging them in their pagan practices. We have to know when are their pagan practices and what they do in their pagan practices. So now we're going to look, let's have a look at a Mishnah. Let's see if I can get this done. Very good. Right. Can you see a text? Yes? Yes? Thank you, Shirley. Right, you can see a text. Good. So this text is headed up, Ancient Origins of Chanukah. So the Mishnah in Avodah Zarah reads as follows. Right, you can follow it in the English if you like. Mishnah says, Ve'elu eidehem shel ovdei kochavim. These are the festivals, pagan festivals, of the ovdei kochavim, of the pagans, who were known to Chazal at the time we're talking about, right, during the Mishnaic period, a couple of thousand years ago. So here's one of them. It's called Kalanda, right? The next one is called Saturnala, and the next one is called Cartisium. These are three Roman names given to different dates in their pagan calendar. And each one of them, we have to be aware that they are engaging in pagan practices. The Yom Ginusia Shel Malchehem, right? And the festival of their kings, the Yom Haledo, the Yom Hamisa, and also the birthdays and the commemorative days of their death of the king, Divi Rabme. Okay, what are we interested in here? There's a lot of interesting historical and cultural material in this Mishnah, what these days are, and what they mean, and what was done. None of this is my interest at the moment, except for one word, and that is this word, Saturnalia. Heaven's name is Saturnalia. Okay, so the Gemara actually asks this question. Let's have a look how the Gemara continues. It says, Omar of Hanan, so the Gemara says, Omar of Hanan Barava. Kalanda and Saturnalia are really two sides of the same coin. How so? Kalanda, he says, is a pagan festival, Shmona Yomim Acha HaTkufa, 8 days after the Tekufa, right? And you'll see here in the English translation, the English translation tells you already that the Tekufa here referred to is the word Tekufa in Chazal means a moment in the year of significance, if you like, in the astronomical significance. So this is the Tekufa we're referring to here. I've highlighted the words, the winter solstice, right? For those people who are not immediately familiar what the winter solstice is, it's generally the 21st of December, 2 days ago. 21st of December every year in the Northern Hemisphere is the winter solstice, which is basically the shortest daylight and the longest night of the year. And the shortest daytime is the winter solstice. In other words, the days get shorter and shorter and shorter, right? Through September, October, November, December. And then when it comes to December the 21st, the word solstice simply means sol, of course, means the sun, right? And stis is Latin, it means solstice means the sun, so to speak, stood still. The sun stands still and it stops getting shorter and it starts getting longer. Okay, so 8 days before the winter solstice is calendar. Let's continue here. Saturna, right? Of course, connected to Saturn, right? And of all the planets, Saturn was considered to be the king of the pagan deities, right? And in fact, okay, Saturna, Shmona Yomim Lifnei Atkufa. So Saturna is 8 days before the winter solstice, and calendar is 8 days after the winter solstice. So they had pagan festivals surrounding the winter solstice. What were they celebrating when they celebrated the 8 days after the winter solstice? So this is the classic pagan sun worship. Basically, it's the idea that Saturnalia was the so to speak, celebrating the rebirth of the sun god, right? They worshipped the sun. The sun had gone into decline in the beginning of the winter, and now suddenly the sun is being reborn, is starting to become stronger. The days are becoming longer, right? When the days start becoming longer, this is the winter solstice. And if you ever want to celebrate the winter solstice properly in the UK, of course, you've got to go to Stonehenge. Some of you are familiar with Stonehenge. I was actually, many years ago, I remember being totally fascinated by the whole of the Stonehenge situation in the UK and what it was used for and how it was used. But it was clearly used for sun worship. And they were able to stand in the middle of this circle of stones, and depending where the sun set between different stones, they would tell which solstice it was, and exactly that. It was basically an astronomical device for knowing the exact time when they should worship the sun god. Right, but this is clearly one of the main themes of ancient Avodah Zarah, right? Avodah Zarah is called by Chazal Avodas Kochovim, worshipping the stars. But of course, of all the stars, the main thing that was worshipped was the sun. The Malbim, incidentally, has got an interesting point that he makes at the beginning of Bereshis about the Hebrew word for the sun, the Shemesh, right? So he says that the Lashon HaKodesh chose a word for the sun of the Shemesh, because of course in Lashon HaKodesh the word Shemesh means shamash, which means a servant, right? In other words, built into the Hebrew language is the idea that the sun is not a god, the sun is the servant of God, right? That the sun serves God in the same way as all the stars and all of nature serves God, right? Serves HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that calling the sun a Shemesh was itself already a criminal offense for the pagan world, to speak of the sun as a servant, where in reality they worship the sun as the sun deity, the sun god, the source of all life, the source of light, the source of warmth, the source of life itself. That was the sun. But the Shemesh, says the Malbim, was to emphasize that the sun, like all of nature, serves God. I'll call upon him. What you have here is a festival of 8 days, which celebrated the birth of the sun god. Now, there's interesting historical stuff here. I'm not such an expert on ancient history, but somebody who is an expert I spoke to a few years ago, so he said what simply happened in the Roman Empire was that at a certain point in the 4th century, the whole Roman Empire converted to Christianity. The whole Roman Empire converted to Christianity. And because they converted to Christianity, but the people on a social level had been used to celebrating 8 days of Saturnalia at this part of the year. So they simply transformed Saturnalia into Christmas. And they made an 8-day Christmas celebration, which is December the 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th, 30th, 31st, 1st of January. Those 8 days, right, were instituted as a Christian reformulation of the ancient pagan festival, which was once worshipping the rebirth of the sun god, and they created a myth. Incidentally, even in Christian literature in the New Testament, there is no evidence whatsoever, right, that Jesus was born on the 25th of December. This simply was a myth that was developed at the beginning of when the Roman Empire desperately needed to convert to Christianity, but not to upset too many people who enjoyed the 8-day Yontif of Saturnalia. They simply renamed it, and they said, well, this is clearly the birth of Jesus, and 8 days later, his circumcision, right? The myth of the birth of Jesus at that particular date simply is based on the earlier pagan rituals of Saturnalia, which itself is connected to the winter solstice and this particular pagan festival that was mentioned by the. So basically, from everything that I've said so far, there's nothing remotely Jewish about this 8-day pagan worship, except that we're now going to look at a Gemara, and the Gemara is going to tell us something extraordinary, and this connection is made by the Maharal of Prague. I haven't seen it made by many people, I must be honest with you. But let's have a look at this. So we're now learning a Gemara from Avodah Zarah Daf Ches, Tov Reish. Tov Reish means Tanu Rabbanon, the rabbis taught. Lefi shero'a Odom Horish, Yom shemisma'et v'holech. Okay, anybody know what that's talking about? And Adam saw the day was getting shorter and shorter. What does that mean, right? Adam Harishon is born Rosh Hashanah, and he's told that if he does an Aveira, eats from the Eitz Hadas, he will die. And what happens is, as the year develops into the winter, the days get shorter and shorter, right? So it's the first time. I want you to imagine for a minute, you are Adam or Eve for that matter, and you're watching the sun, and the sun provides the light and the warmth, and every day it's getting a bit shorter, getting shorter and shorter. And you know you've done a sin, you know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has said, that by doing this sin, you're going to die. So what says the Gemara? Omar, he said, this is Adam Harishon said, Oy li, I'm in trouble. Shema bishvil shesarachti, maybe because of my transgression, olam choshuch ba'adi, maybe the world is becoming a dark place. Maybe I am doomed to live the rest of my life in darkness. Maybe that's the punishment that God has destined for me on account of my sins. And not only that, it could be the whole of the world is simply winding down and will return to nothingness. And that's the death that has been decreed upon me, min hashamayim. So what did he do? Omad v'yoshav shmona yomim b'tainas tefillah. He made for himself 8 days where he was fasting and davening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu to accept his tshuva, to accept his repentance for his sin of the eight sadas. So basically, at this time of year, Adam and Chava were in a panic, in a certain sense, and they were interpreting, we would say misinterpreting, but that time they were interpreting the shortening of the days as something which was an impending disaster. Kevan shero'o tekufas teves v'ro'o yerich v'holech. Oops. Right. So he saw that the winter solstice had arrived, and he saw that the days were Yom Shemarich v'holech. The days were starting to get longer. Right. So at a certain point, he saw that actually the sun reached a certain low point and then started growing again. Omar, he said, Min Hogash Olam, it must be that this is a natural cycle, right? What happens, says the Gemara, Hola va'asa shemona yomim tovim, made 8-day Yom Tov. So here you have Adam Rishon celebrating an 8-day Yom Tov L'Shem Shamayim, and he's thanking God and he's praising God for 8 days. Why? Because the days have started to become a bit longer, right? And that's every year. The beginning of Hanukkah is the winter solstice. We're always within a few days of the winter solstice when we start Hanukkah, right? So this year, for example, we're just a week away from the winter solstice. Usually it's much closer than that. Usually it's within a day or two. It's because of this the way the year works out. I'll call upon him. This 8 days, right? The 8-day festival of Saturnalia was originally, right? So look at the last line here of this Gemara. Who kov om Shammai? This feast day, this Yom Tov, was originally made by Adam and Chava l'Shem Shammai. They were praising God. So one of the interesting things here is that Chazal sort of are what they're doing here is they're sort of taking over the entire pagan practice of this worship, this pagan worship, and saying you should know, find Chazal in a few places that they show, because Chazal, as we all know, had Torah Shabbal Peh. How do Chazal know this story about Adam Rishon? This is what's called Torah Shabbal Peh. This is a traditionally transmitted, orally transmitted tradition. Like Chazal knew lots of things about Adam Rishon, about Noach, about all the events in Sefer Bereshis. That was simply part of Torah Shabbal Peh, the orally transmitted tradition of Klal Yisrael handed down from one generation to the next. So part of Torah Shabbal Peh is this very beautiful piece of information, because the Jews lived in a pagan world and they looked around and all the pagans were celebrating Saturnalia. Incidentally, Saturnalia was 8 days of complete promiscuity and overindulgence and debauchery, and it was celebrated in a very, very physical, immoral, and violent way, and it was really just mayhem. And then what they were celebrating was the return of the sun god. Right? What Chazal are telling us here is that actually this 8-day festival, starting at the winter solstice, was the idea of Adam Rishon, and he wasn't at all worshipping the sun. He was thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu that his tshuva had been accepted, and that the sun was not on its way to extinction, but the sun was going through a cycle, and the days would start getting longer. So it's really turning the tables. It's very interesting, sort of historically and spiritually turning the tables from this 8-day pagan debauched celebration into 8 days of simcha and praise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that he's given us the light of the world and the sun, and Hameya La'oretz, L'Adorim Oleh Barachamim, the beauty of nature. Now, what happened, of course, is what we need to do now is take this whole story of the Gemara and superimpose it on the story of Hanukkah. So here you have the story of Hanukkah, where the pagan world had succeeded in contaminating the Beis Hamikdash. All the oil was contaminated, and that was just a symbol of the fact that the whole temple was contaminated, right? And they brought all sorts of pagan sacrifices on the Mizbeach, and the whole of the Har HaBayis had become a temple dedicated to pagan worship at that time. And the Jewish people were going through terrible, terrible persecutions, and the Roman and the pre-Roman Hellenist culture was oppressive and forbade the worship of God and really imposed paganism on them in the most terrible way, outlawed Bris Milah, outlawed Shabbos, and inflicted all sorts of humiliations on the Jewish people. And then was the great turnaround. The turnaround was right? The battle against the Yevonim that we all know about already from kindergarten, and the wonderful Hatzalah of Hanukkah. But what I want to suggest to you in the name of the Maharal of Prague is Chazal clearly decided to create a new Chag. They decided, right, we're talking about midway through the Second Temple period, roughly the year 160 BCE. Around that period, Chazal decided that they're going to institute a Yontef to commemorate this great event. What the Maharal is suggesting, though, and I find this very, very fascinating and thought-provoking, is that when the Chazal sat down to decide on a new Yontef, they didn't start with a blank sheet. They didn't sit down and think, well, here we've got a blank piece of paper. What should we do? Should it be a 1-day Yontef, a 2-day Yontef? Should it be a Yontef where we emphasizes singing and dancing? Should it be a Yontef which emphasizes military victories? What should we do about it? What they did was they revived an ancient Yontef of Adam and Chava. Adam and Chava invented 8 days of Yontef to celebrate the return of the light to the world. And that return of the light was not in a pagan context, Chas v'Shalom, but in a context of Avodas Hashem. So the Chachamim said, look, let's take that format and let's reinvent, right? Let's reinvent the old format of an 8-day light festival. And therefore they created Hanukkah this time of year as an 8-day light festival, as a, if you like, a new format to an ancient Yontef, probably the oldest Yontef that we have in Jewish record at all. We have no other Yomim Tovim, to the best of my knowledge, of Adam and Chava. We have no records of Adam and Chava celebrating any other Yomim Tovim. But we do know that this is what they celebrated. And it was a light festival. It was so what Chazal did, they said, look, we're going to celebrate the return of the light, but which light? Not the light of the Goyim, which is paganism, but the light of the menorah, which is the light, Kineh Mitzvah, the Torah Or, is the light of the Torah and the light of the Beis Hamikdash, which nearly was extinguished. And now we have the Zuchus to revive it and bring it back into Jewish life again. So they instituted Hanukkah in this context. And I think that is something quite extraordinary. I think that is quite extraordinary and gives us to the understanding of how Hanukkah came to be the way it was. And clearly, Chazal wanted it to emphasize the if you like, never-ending light, the infinite light of the Torah. And possibly they even saw the writing on the wall of the eventual destruction of the Bais Sheni. They saw that the Hasmonean dynasty of kings who were built after the Hanukkah story, they were really not going to last forever, and that the influences from Rome and other places were increasing all the time, and they wanted to make sure that the light of the Beis HaMikdash didn't go out with the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Because that's one of the most amazing things. When you light your menorah, ladies and gentlemen, when you light your menorah, Bez Hashem, on Sunday evening, you light your first light, you should have in mind that this is the only real remnant we have of the Beis HaMikdash. The light of the menorah is the light of the Torah and the Ruchnius of the Beis HaMikdash. And Chazal told us that even though we've lost the Korbanos, we've lost the Mincha, the Nesachim, and we've lost all sorts of, almost everything, the Kohen Gadol and the Urim V'Tumim have all been lost, but the light of the menorah has not been lost. The light of the menorah is infinite. And it's not chas v'shalom, the pagan idea of the light of the sun, which is a god. It's quite the opposite. It's the way in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu lights up our world with the light of Kedusha and the light of Ruchnius, and that all comes still from the Beis HaMikdash. And that's something very interesting about light itself. I mentioned to you before because it made a big impression on me many years ago, speaking to a scientist who explained to me that actually when on a clear nighttime sky and you look up into the vast sky and you see all those stars, he said you should know that some of the stars that you're seeing actually don't exist. Some of those stars that you're seeing existed maybe a few million years ago, but they've died and they've exploded and they're not there anymore. But they are so far away, so many light years away. What does it mean that something is light years away? It means that it takes light years to travel. So basically, we are still receiving light waves that we can pick up with our eyes from something which doesn't physically exist anymore. The star itself has blown out, has destroyed itself, but the light that is sent out into space continues traveling, even though the star is not there anymore, right? And therefore, we are actually seeing things. We're seeing the light, even though the physical planet, the physical whatever it was, star which gave out that light, is no longer in existence. And I thought that was a fantastic mashal for Hanukkah. Hanukkah, we are seeing the light of the menorah, even though the Beis HaMikdash is no longer there, but the light of the Beis HaMikdash continues forever. And that light is Kiner Mitzvah, the Torah Or, that is our emunah and our chesed and our mitzvahs. They all constitute that light of the menorah. And each year it's Mosif HaHolech. Each year we light it in such a way to express the idea that it's getting stronger and stronger. And it's very interesting because that was really Adam Arishan's observation. His observation was that the days were getting strong. If you think of the 8 days of the menorah, you can visualize each day getting a bit longer. The strength of the light gets stronger and stronger every day. Right? Once you pass the winter solstice, every day the day gets longer, the sun gets stronger, and therefore the lights of the menorah make a lot of sense. But it's most of a holech, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, getting stronger and stronger every day. But we're not worshipping the light. On the contrary, we're not allowed to use them. They're not part of the physical world. Why are they not part of the physical world? Is because they're part of the hektish, right? We can watch the light of the menorah and reflect on the amazing Nisim by Yomim Maheim Bazman, those days of great Nisim for Yehuda Maccabee and his followers, and that HaKadosh Baruch Hu allowed us to be dedicated to Bayis Sheni. But it's not just about ancient history. It's about being able in every generation to relight that menorah and to bring back into our lives that light from the Beis Hamikdash. And I find it very, very fascinating, this connection on so many different levels, starting with Adam Arishon, right, who suddenly realized that his tshuva had been accepted and the world wasn't going to be switched off, going through millennia of pagan worship, who were worshipping simply the return of the sun god, and then picked up by Chazal, right, at the time of the Mishnah, right, they picked up that ancient yontif of Adam Arishon and rededicated it to modern events of the time, that the light of the menorah had not been extinguished, even though it looked like it was going to be extinguished. It wasn't going to be extinguished. And that was really, I think, one of the beauties, something original to say this year Hanukkah. Everybody knows the story of the little jug of oil that lasted for 8 days. Everybody knows the story of Yehuda Maccabee and the great Nisim, Sh'asa Nisim L'Avoseinu. Rav Shlomo Goren, some of you might remember. If you remember Rav Shlomo Goren, Rav Shlomo Goren was one of the chief rabbis of Israel, passed away in 1995. And he was an amazing, powerful, he was first the chief rabbi of Tzahal for many years. And then he was chief rabbi of Israel. And he was a great innovator. He made himself somewhat unpopular over the years because he didn't consult with any of his colleagues. He just said what he believed to be true and got on with it, and was somewhat brusque with his other rabbinical colleagues, as a result of which he got into certain difficulties. But he as a person was a great man. He was a great individual, a great Talmud Chacham. One of the things that he wanted to try and innovate was, after the 6-day war, that we should make a bracha she'asa nisim la'avoseinu. What do we say? We say she'asa nisim la'avoseinu b'yomim ha'heim b'zman hazeh, right? So Rav Goren wanted to institute that we should say she'asa nisim la'avoseinu v'lanu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has done miracles for our ancestors and for us. And it started in those days and it continues to this day. He wanted to add in the word v'lanu. As Rav Shlomo Goren was so carried away by the Nisim, particularly of the 6-day war. But what he meant was the Nisim of the whole of Medinat Israel, the nace of the existence of the Jewish state, surrounded by so many millions of people who want to destroy us. And again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks after us and protects us. So I'm not suggesting that you change the bracha, ladies and gentlemen. I don't want you to come away from this shir and say, Rabbi Kimche says, the new bracha is, She'asa nisim la'avoseinu v'lanu. But you can have in mind v'lanu, even if you don't say it. She'asa nisim la'avoseinu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has done miracles for our ancestors, and for us, that we can sit in Yerushalayim and in Gush Etzion, and that we can sit in Israel, and we can feel that we can practice Torah and mitzvahs, and we can feel confident, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu protects our soldiers, our young men and women who put their life on the line to protect us, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks after them and protects us from our enemies. That is nothing short of a nace. It's just that we're in the middle of it. When you're in the middle of a nace, it's sometimes difficult to recognize just how miraculous it is. But the miraculous nature of Medinat Yisrael, said Rav Shlomo Goren, merits a reference in our bracha. You should say, She'asa nisim la'avoseinu, and think in your mind, v'lanu. And for us, b'yomim ha'heim b'zman hazeh, it was in those days, but it's still going on today. B'zman hazeh, it was in those days. And in this shir, if I've given you a little bit of an additional thought about what the Yomim HaHeim are. Normally you think by Yomim HaHeim means in those days, meaning the times of Bimei Matisyahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol. But actually, Hanukkah goes back to Adam and Chava, back to Sefer Bereshis. And it goes back to the theme that I mentioned here in this whole course of Shiur in the middle of at the moment. Everything in Jewish life has its roots in Sefer Bereshis, even Hanukkah. Hanukkah is rooted in Adam and Chava. He celebrated 8 days after the winter solstice that his tshuva had been accepted and that nature was regaining its strength as a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that Yom Tov was revived by Chazal in the Hanukkah story and turned into a celebration of the Bayis Sheni. Incidentally, this story that I just told you today and this Gemara is also another answer to the famous question, which is sometimes called the question of the Beis Yosef, because of Yosef Karo 500 years ago, really makes an issue out of this question. It says, why was it a Yom Tov for 8 days? There was enough oil in the jug for a day, so it was only really a nace for 7 days. The fact that the jug of oil lasted for 8 days gives us 7 miraculous days, but 1 day was not miraculous at all. So why do we celebrate it for 8 days? Okay, so there are, I once saw a sefer put out that I think about 75 different answers to this question. Some of them a little bit spurious, but quite a few of them some very good ones. The classic answer given by the Rishonim, incidentally, to this question is that the nace was that on every day of the 8 days, only 1/8 of the oil burnt. In other words, it burnt for a whole day and only used up 1/8 of the quantity. So it actually was miraculous for a full 8 days. But on a historical level, based on how the Maharal read that Gemara and Avodah Zarah, there's another answer to this question. It could have been that the miracle of the oil only lasted for 7 days, or maybe it only lasted for 2 or 3 days. It's not the point. The point is Chazal wanted to give us a Yom Tov, which was drawing on the Emunah and Yiras Shamayim of Adam and Chava and their celebrations, which were in a sense to negate and to oppose pagan worship of their day, and to show that actually the pagan worship of their day was itself a corruption of earlier feast days, which were L'Shem Shamayim. So therefore the story historically has got an additional depth to it once you link it up to Sefer Bereshis and Adam and Chava. And it's yet another answer to that famous question of why for 8 days. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. That's what I wanted to share with you today. And this is a little bit of extra Hanukkah Torah. Somebody told me something wonderful about why do we eat donuts and latkes, the most unhealthy, fattening food conceivable on Hanukkah? And the answer is, of course, that the Greeks worshipped fitness and the body culture. So we want to show on Hanukkah that we do not believe in the fitness and the health, the Hellenistic idea of fitness and health and body culture. We're going to eat latkes and donuts till we burst. And by doing that, we are showing that we're not going to accept the Hellenistic values. Okay, I mean, I think that's, I'm telling you this not as a Dvar Torah. I hasten to point out, this last bit was not a Dvar Torah, it was actually a joke, but quite a good joke. I thought it was quite a good, so the next time somebody offers you endless latkes, you can say, well, I'll eat it l'shem shamayim. What do you say, Shirley? It's a good idea, no?
Great idea. I think Martin definitely approves of that. He likes latkes to keep
That's it, Martin. When she's offering you the 3rd donut, You're going to say, I'm eating this third donut, L'Shem Shamayim, to show that we're not Hellenists. That the Dafka, we're not Hellenists. And here goes the third donut.